The numbers were perfect. Every quarter, without fail, the reports landed on the desks of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the European Union. Growth figures, inflation rates, employment statistics, all of them clean, all of them consistent, all of them pointing in exactly the right direction. For 30 years, Greece was the model of a developing economy done right. A small Mediterranean nation pulling itself into the modern world. Investors poured in. Credit ratings climbed. The EU welcomed them with open arms and open wallets. There was just one problem. None of it was real. Athens, Greece, 1981. The year Greece joins the European community. It is a moment of enormous national pride. Centuries of history, ancient democracy, the birthplace of Western civilization, finally taking its place at the table of modern Europe. But Greece in 1981 is not what it presents itself to be. The economy is fragile. The public sector is bloated beyond reason. Political parties have spent decades buying votes with government jobs, pensions, and subsidies that the country simply cannot afford. The tax system is a suggestion. The black market is enormous. And the gap between what Greece officially reports and what Greece actually earns is already widening. What happens next is not the story of one corrupt official or one bad decision. It is the story of a system, political, financial, institutional, that collectively decided it was easier to lie than to fix. And for 30 years, the lie worked. The mechanics of it were elegant in their simplicity. Greece needed to meet certain economic benchmarks to qualify for EU membership benefits, and eventually the euro. Debt levels had to stay below a certain percentage of GDP. Deficit spending had to remain within agreed limits. The numbers had to look right, so the numbers were made to look right. Military spending was moved off the books. Debt was shuffled into complex financial instruments that technically didn't count as debt. Goldman Sachs, one of the most prestigious financial institutions in the world, was paid hundreds of millions of dollars to help design the transactions that hid billions in Greek borrowing from official statistics. This is the part that gets buried in the footnotes. It wasn't just Greece, the banks knew. The instruments were specifically designed to obscure. Goldman Sachs structured a currency swap in 2001 that allowed Greece to effectively borrow billions while reporting it as a currency transaction rather than a loan. The deal was entirely legal. It was also entirely designed to deceive. When this later came to light, Goldman Sachs expressed no remorse. They had done nothing wrong under the rules as written. The rules, it turned out, had been written by people who trusted that nobody would do exactly what Goldman Sachs did. Inside Greece, the lie required cooperation at every level. Politicians knew, finance ministers knew, senior civil servants knew. The statistical agency, the body responsible for reporting Greece's official numbers to the EU, was staffed with political appointees who understood their job was not to count accurately, but to count correctly. Correctly meaning whatever number was needed. Andreas Georgiou found this out the hard way. In 2010, at the height of the crisis, Georgiou was appointed to head the Greek Statistical Agency. He was an outsider, a former IMF economist who had spent his career in Washington. He came back to Greece with one intention: to count the numbers honestly. What he found when he arrived was not a statistical agency. It was a fiction department. He revised the deficit figures. He reported the real numbers. The actual debt, the actual shortfall, the numbers that had been hidden, smoothed, and reclassified for decades. Greece's deficit for 2009, previously reported at around 6% of GDP, was revised to over 15%. The markets responded immediately. Credit ratings collapsed, borrowing costs exploded, and suddenly the full scale of what had been hidden for 30 years was visible to everyone. Georgiou became the most hated man in Greece, not the politicians who had built the lie, not the finance ministers who had signed off on the false reports, not the Goldman Sachs bankers who had engineered the instruments to hide the debt. The man who told the truth. He was prosecuted multiple times. Greek prosecutors charged him with inflating the deficit figures, the very figures that every independent international body confirmed were accurate. The charges were absurd on their face and repeatedly thrown out by courts, then refiled, then thrown out again, then refiled. For a decade, Andreas Georgiou fought a legal system being used as a weapon against him by the people whose lies he had exposed. He eventually left Greece and returned to the United States, where he had built his career before his brief, devastating attempt to fix the numbers. Sound familiar? The collapse, when it came, was total. In 2010, Greece could no longer borrow money at rates it could afford. The interest on its debt was consuming the entire economy. It went to the EU and the IMF with its handout. What followed was the most severe austerity program imposed on a developed nation in modern history. Pensions were slashed, salaries were cut, hospitals ran out of medicine, unemployment hit 27%, youth unemployment hit 60%. A generation of educated Greeks left the country and never came back. The human cost of 30 years of false false accounting landed entirely on the people who had the least to do with the lie. The pensioner who lost half her income had not designed the Goldman Sachs swap. The young doctor who emigrated to Germany had not appointed the political statisticians. The family that lost their business in the depression that followed had not signed the deficit reports. But they paid. Every one of them paid. The bailouts came in 3 waves, a total of over 300 billion euros, the largest financial rescue in history at the time. Attached to conditions so severe that they reshaped Greek society for a generation. And through all of it, the question that never received a satisfying answer was the one that mattered most. Who was responsible? Not Greece in the abstract. Not the economy as a concept. Specific people made specific decisions over 30 years. Specific politicians signed specific documents. Specific bankers structured specific deals. Specific officials appointed specific statisticians and told them specifically what numbers to produce. Almost none of them faced legal consequences of any significance. The former prime ministers gave interviews. The former finance ministers published op-eds arguing about who was most to blame, always pointing at someone else. Goldman Sachs paid a relatively minor fine in an unrelated matter and continued operating as before. The machinery of accountability, so swift and brutal when applied to ordinary Greeks through austerity, moved with extraordinary gentleness when it turned toward the architects of the lie. Greece today is recovering, slowly, painfully, with a smaller population and a diminished public sector, and a generation of talent that built careers in London and Berlin and New York instead of Athens. The economy has stabilized. The debt is still enormous, but being managed. The crisis, by most official measures, is over. What hasn't recovered is trust. Greeks who lived through the collapse have a specific understanding of institutions that their counterparts in more stable countries don't share. They know what it looks like when the numbers are fiction. They know what it costs when the fiction ends. They know that the people who build the lie and the people who suffer its collapse are almost never the same people. This isn't just a Greek story. It is a story about what happens when the incentive to look stable is stronger than the incentive to be stable, when the reward for reporting good numbers outweighs the reward for having good numbers, when the institutions designed to check the counting are staffed by people appointed by the people being counted. It is a story about how a lie told consistently enough by enough people across enough time stops feeling like a lie. It becomes the reality that everyone agrees to maintain because the alternative, the truth, is too expensive to face. Until it isn't. Until one man sits down with the actual figures and types the actual numbers into the actual report. And the whole thing comes apart in a single quarter. Andreas Georgiou did not cause the Greek crisis. He revealed it. The distinction matters enormously and was almost completely lost in the decade of prosecutions that followed. The crisis was caused 30 years earlier, in the quiet offices where ministers and statisticians and bankers sat together and decided that the number on the page mattered more than the number in the world. Georgiou just stopped agreeing, and for that, they never forgave him.